Welcome to the OK, Let's Learn podcast. This is two podcasts in one where we dive into great stories and books, and another where we just dive into tons of different topics. My name is Kevin O'Keefe. So today, OK, let's learn about the New York Mets of Major League Baseball in the United States of America. Yes, in the National League, and I know some of my audience may be thinking, wait a minute, this is outside of what I normally do, and yes, it is. But even if you're not a baseball fan or a sports fan, stay with me on this journey because it's interesting, fascinating, and we'll weave some stories, some personal stories about this amazing team. And yes, why am I doing the podcast? This team was born in 1962, the same year that I was born. What is the beginning? What is the genesis of this team? It comes from a time period in the mid-50s where you had two teams in the National League in Major League Baseball, the Brooklyn Dodgers and the New York Giants. And yes, over there in the American League, you had the big, bad New York Yankees. Three teams in New York City. And yes, New York City, the biggest city in the world, could handle all three teams. But here's what happened. The New York Giants up in the Polo Ground in Upper Manhattan. Keep in mind that all through this time period, through World War II, and baseball had been around since the turn of the century. So teams predominantly were in urban centers in the middle of cities. So what happens as we come out of World War II into the 1950s? The suburbs became where people ended up living, and driving to the stadiums became a way of life. And these stadiums were not updated. The Polo Grounds in Upper Manhattan was falling apart. The owner of the team, Horace Stoneham, who had inherited the team from his father, was facing financial difficulties. People weren't coming to the games as much. As we go into the late 50s, this team was suffering and they needed a way out. Quietly, they were looking, believe it or not, at Minnesota as a possible place to relocate. But this was the New York Giants. This was the era of the Giants win the pennant. The Giants win the pennant. The Giants win the pennant. Yes, Willie Mays, Willie McCovey, just icons throughout the city. And now this team is looking to leave. And south of the Polo Grounds was Ebbets Field, the Brooklyn Dodgers. Yes, the team that brought Jackie Robinson to the major leagues, smashed the color barrier, a team that was iconic also for many reasons, but with a stadium that needed to be built, again, with the idea to modernize. Walter O'Malley, the owner, was looking at a dome stadium right there at Atlantic and Flatbush Avenues in Brooklyn, but there was this powerful New York City planner by the name of Robert Moses. If you're looking for a great book to read, it's by Robert Caro. It's called The Power Broker. Here was a gentleman that was not elected at all, but yet wielded so much power. Everything about the infrastructure around New York City, the parks, the highways, and yes, now the stadiums became a reality because of this one man. Well, he came up against Walter O'Malley, and he wanted, and he told Walter O'Malley that he needed to build his stadium in Queens if he was looking to get any kind of support from New York City. And Robert Moses was right. This was a changing landscape with suburbia becoming a reality and people needing to go to the games. So he was big with having a parking lot, lots of room, and this was only available from his vantage point in Flushing, Queens. Walter O'Malley balked, and what ended up happening? Both O'Malley and Stoneham ended up going out to the West Coast. The Dodgers became the Los Angeles Dodgers. The Giants became the San Francisco Giants. And initially, O'Malley, although he didn't necessarily go out there in collaboration with Stoneham, what he ended up finding out or realizing right away is that at this point, being the only team on the West Coast and every other team being on the East Coast, in terms of costs, going back and forth with the train and planes, this was not going to work. So it just made sense for both of them in terms of travel to have both of them out there. Stoneham got rid of the idea about going to Minnesota, and here they are on the West Coast, and New York was in mourning. 1957, they ended the season, the baseball season. By the time spring training came along in 1958, they're out on the West Coast. So immediately, a group of people, powerful people in New York City, led by this lawyer by the name of William Shea, started to figure out what they were going to do. And what was their strategy? Very simply, Shea came up with this brilliant idea about forcing Major League's hand by threatening to have a new league that would compete with Major League Baseball. At this time, Major League Baseball, we think of it as one, but it was really two separate leagues, the American League and the National League. He proposed this Continental League. He got backing, he got ideas for stadiums. Everything was in motion. So they caved. Baseball caved, gave New York and William Shea their own team. And interestingly enough, obviously the first stadium that the Mets had was named Shea Stadium for William Shea. But when they had to come up with a name for the team, and this is why I was laughing, they threw it out to the public and there was this contest. The finalists for the names were the New York Bees, the New York Burros, the New York Continentals, and the New York Skyliners. But ultimately, the name that won was the New York Mets, short for Metropolitans. Big, important, urban. And the colors, a lot of Mets fans, this generation coming up, they may not know this. The colors of the Mets being blue and orange comes from the blue of the Dodgers and the orange from the New York Giants. So here they are now. The team is born in 1962, and there was this expansion draft. How are you going to get new players? Well, back then, ultimately, each team was able to protect a certain amount of players. And ultimately, by the way, the Houston Astros were the other team in 1962 that were born with the Mets. So ultimately, when they drafted players from other teams, the ones that were left available, the Mets only got older veterans, injured players, guys that ultimately lived on the bench, and maybe some prospects that the teams didn't think were that worthy. So, 1962, they called them the lovable losers. They went of 160 games. Their record was 40 and 120. 120 losses. One of the worst seasons ever in Major League Baseball. And why were they the lovable losers? Because their manager was Casey Stengel, who had made his name with the Yankees, and he was someone that was well-respected and well-liked, and all he did was lose. And this became our mindset as Met fans. Again, this team is the same age as me. We have an inferiority complex because of the big bad New York Yankees across town. And we have this always sense of dread that began with who we were as losers. And even through ups and downs, there's always this sense of no, things will not happen that will be good. And we had, as you'll see, we've had success through the years. But if you're a Met fan, you know this sense of what is going to come next. When will we fail? It's this hopeless way of of, of an existence, of being a fan. There's sports, there's the thrill of victory, and there's the agony of defeat. And as Pat Riley of the Los Angeles Lakers, and yes, for a short time as the coach of the New York Knicks, once famously said, there's winning and there's misery. And by the way, talk about a future episode, New York Knickerbockers, absolutely, and yes, the Dallas Cowboys. But we're here to talk about the New York Mets, so let's dive into the eras, the famous players, the managers, the best teams, the best moments, the worst moments. Here we go. As we came out of this era of losing, we're talking about 1965, something shifted that was huge. This time period, there was no draft. It was amateur players that were signed directly, which favored teams with a lot of money. In 1965, the first amateur draft occurred. This favored the Mets because they were losing for all this time. And now all of a sudden they got high draft positions and they drafted well. And they hired a general manager who became instrumental in drafting pitchers. His name was George Weiss. He was their general manager, and he stockpiled all these young arms. So at the point where we're now coming into 1968, you had Tom Seaver, Jerry Koosman, Gary Gentry, and yes, the icon Nolan Ryan. What ended up happening? 68, the year of the pitcher. They went from losing 120 games in 62 to winning 100 games in 1969. But the transition was 68, where they finished 73 and 89, still below 500, but a huge improvement. And what happened at the same time? They ended up splitting the National League into divisions. So now you had the National League East that included the Cubs, the Cardinals, the Pirates, the Phillies, and the Expos. This year, 69, they were not guaranteed to do well, but they surged in August. The Cubs had been leading the division for most of the season. They ended up surging past Chicago, and then they got to the World Series, and they beat the heavily favored Baltimore Orioles. They were so huge underdogs. It cannot be understated. This 69 was when we landed on the moon. Yes, the Jets won the Super Bowl, the third one, and the New York Mets were known as the Miracle Mets. So you had established easily Tom Seaver, who was the franchise. He was my favorite player. He was my idol. I had posters of him on my bedroom walls, and the Mets were my team. Here I was in third grade, Mrs. Hawkins at Martha W. Lawrence School in Poughkeepsie, New York. And yes, I was 7 years old, but you know, if you're a sports fan, you're picking your team, that's the impressionable age. And sure enough, my father wasn't a big sports fan. His father, my grandfather, Paul, I called him, he was a fan of the New York Giants. And yes, my father was a baseball fan, but he didn't live and die with baseball. So I had to pick my own team. As a matter of fact, just to digress a little bit, one of the most memorable moments that my father relayed about my grandfather, I called him Paul, was in that shot heard round the world, which was the home run on October 3rd, 1951. Just like the Mets had come back to beat the Cubs all those years later, what happened during this time? Well, they called it the shot heard round the world because Robbie Thompson hit this 3-run walk-off homer in the bottom of the ninth inning off of Ralph Branca of the Brooklyn Dodgers, the dreaded Brooklyn Dodgers. And my grandfather, as the story goes, pulled off the West Side Highway and started screaming, just as the announcer did, as I relayed before, the Giants win the pennant, the Giants win the pennant. I can just picture this, and it's so much part of the history of the O'Keefe family. My father loves talking about that. My grandfather was a huge Giant fan, and that carried forward with my Aunt Patsy and my Aunt Florence, my father's two sisters. And I will say this, I was at my grandfather's house in Yonkers, New York, and that dreaded day in 1972. It was April 2nd. I'll never forget it. I heard the news that Gil Hodges, the famous manager, the retired manager of the New York Mets who had played with the Brooklyn Dodgers, he brought them the championship in '69, and he passed away at such a young age, a heart attack out there playing golf. It was Easter and Easter weekend, and that was when I heard the news. It was something that was so indelible in my memory. And another thing, just to throw out a little history of my family, I got so much of my love of statistics and love of baseball. My grandfather would have the sporting news, huge back then. The statistics from each week would be there, and I'd go down to see him. He'd sit there right in the living room at his chair, just pouring over all statistics. And you know what? He did not become a Mets fan, but we inherited. When I say me, myself, all my cousins, basically inherited the Giants fandom as now Mets fandom. My grandfather ultimately followed the Giants out there to San Francisco because, of course, you can't just be a fan of Willie Mays and then just leave your team. Back to the Mets. What ends up happening now? You have the era of the 1973 Mets. Yes, they were competitive. Yes, every year was a good year. And now 1973 was different. 1973, they were barely a 500 team, and they won the pennant, yes, coming down the stretch with the iconic Tug McGraw, the relief pitcher, who said, "You gotta believe." And he would come off the mound after getting a great strikeout. His distinct wind up and follow through. If you're a Mets fan, you know it. And he would come off that mound slapping and banging his mitt against his thigh in celebration. And here they go right through the World Series. I was in 5th grade. I remember hanging out with John Blumberg, again, Poughkeepsie, New York. And listen, we were going up against the big bad Mustache Gang. This was the era of the Oakland A's of Reggie Jackson, Gene Tennis, Joe Rudy. You had even Vita Blue, the pitcher. This team was dominant. They won the World Series 3 years in a row, and we just couldn't beat them. But our manager was Yogi Berra. We had a lot of players that ultimately became iconic. If you're a Mets fan, we had John Milner, we had John Matlack, but it wasn't to be. Going from this point, we became losers again, but now we weren't lovable losers. It was just mediocrity. We're talking about 76 and 77, and Tom Seaver, the franchise, is getting frustrated. And this was the points, 1975 with Andy Messersmith of the Angels. Free agency was born. And just to back up a little bit in terms of the history of baseball, you have to understand that teams controlled players. Players did not make a living, a good living, like they do today. There was something called the reserve clause, which ultimately bound a player to a team. Now today, beginning around this time period, players had the leverage. They could ultimately sign contracts, and then after a certain number of years, they could decide to leave or certainly negotiate a better contract with their team. And this was what Tom Seaver basically was looking to do. He had two people that were thorns in his side. Number one was the general manager. His name was M. Donald Grant. He was old school philosophy. He didn't really think that players should be challenging ownership. He thought that salaries were getting out of control, and he basically was dictating to Tom Seaver. And as it came out later, we also learned the other thorn in the side of Tom Seaver was this journalist, a really powerful journalist. You don't see this these days. His name was Dick Young of the New York Daily News. He was also old school. And when I say that, He disliked the power, the growing power of players in this new era, and his reach was huge. This was, again, a time period of course, no social media. You got one newspaper, two newspapers, and a few columnists, and what they wrote really carried a lot of weight. And what did he do during this whole time period of trying to negotiate a new contract? Dick Young suggested that Tom Seaver was being influenced by his wife, Nancy, in all these contract negotiations, implying that she was pushing him to demand more money. He actually wrote that he was being brainwashed and questioned whether Nancy Seaver was, quote, wearing the pants in the family, unquote. OMG, you can see why Tom Seaver, I remember reading articles at the time, he was at a pool when he read this, and he was livid. At that point, he demanded a trade, and they called it the Midnight Massacre. June 15th, 1977, I still remember getting that horrible issue of the Sports Illustrated in the mail. Again, this is when magazines mattered. You would get them once a week. And here was our beloved Tom Seaver in a Cincinnati Reds uniform. This became the nadir of our franchise, the lowest point. And yes, we did not bounce back for years. We're talking about the late 70s, early 80s. We're talking about the time period of Craig Swan, who was a great pitcher for his time period, but he didn't win any games because the team wasn't any good. We had Doug Flynn, we had Steve Henderson, we had Pat Zachary, all players that were traded for Seaver, and no, they didn't come through. So what happens next? As we go into the 80s, now we're looking at the time period of the big bad boys. We start because, again, the roller coaster of a franchise, you're no good, you lose, then you get high draft picks. One by one, we started collecting great young players. Darryl Strawberry, Dwight Gooden, then strategically with new ownership. And by the way, the original owners was Joan Payson from 62 to 75. She was instrumental, of course, with bringing the Mets to baseball. But when she passed away in 1975, her husband wasn't interested in sports. And then you talk about looking back on this time period, it's not coincidental that the Mets as a team were floundering on the field because the ownership structure was floundering. The heirs, the children of Mr. Payson, ultimately they sold it in 1980 to the publisher, the book company, Doubleday and Company, which was led by Nelson Doubleday Jr. and this fellow by the name of Fred Wilpon, who was a real estate investor. He was a minority partner. Ultimately, this became the new Mets renaissance. New owners, new blood, new interest in the team. And like I said, with strategic trades with their new general manager, his name was Frank Cashin from those big bad Baltimore Orioles. They had success with them. He brought cachet. He brought success. And yes, he pulled off trades beginning in 1983, brought in Keith Hernandez, the iconic first baseman, still a announcer for the New York Mets. Then the next year, 1984, Gary Carter, the famous catcher from the Montreal Expos. And all of a sudden, with a combination of young talent that I mentioned before, Dwight Gooden, Darryl Strawberry, you had Mookie Wilson, you had Lenny Dykstra, you had Wally Backman. This became the big bad New York Mets of 1986, and here they are in the World Series after defeating the Houston Astros in a nail-biting National League Championship Series. So here we are now, October 1986. I was recently graduated from college in 1984. I was a salesman for automatic data processing, ADP, selling payroll services to companies throughout Westchester County, living with my two best friends, Dave Goodman and Mitch Letterstein in New Rochelle, New York. And Dave and I actually went up to see his brother Gary, up in UMass. We called it ZooMass. And here we are playing basketball. It's game 2. Looking forward to hanging out in Gary's frat house later on. We go out and we play basketball, pickup game. I can still remember it. And I was dominating, of course, in my own head. I go up and I come down on my shoulder, dislocated shoulder. I go to the hospital. Dave is driving me. I am screaming in pain. I didn't know what was going on. I almost passed out. I get to the hospital. They slowly but surely put my shoulder back in place. And here I am in the middle of this game 2. Yes, the Mets lost because the ball went through Tim Tuffle's leg at second base. And I am at the tippy top of this frat house, probably 5 stories high, in this tiny little room of Gary's, and just quietly sleeping off my pain, not caring at all about the Mets, but certainly looking back, an unbelievable memory. And here we are now, back home, Game 6, the iconic Game 6 against the Boston Red Sox. The Mets are down. They only have one more out. They're gone. Their dream season is over. The Red Sox would win the World Series, but of course they didn't. So here I am with my best friend, Dave Goodman. We're sitting on the couch in New Rochelle, New York, this rundown old house that we just, we're surviving in, a typical bachelor pad. And yes, our other great friend who passed away too soon. Rest in peace, Mitch Letterstein. This podcast goes out to you. He was there with us as well, with my girlfriend, Lisa, who became my wife. We're just sitting there, just drowning in our sorrows. This is over. And then Gary Carter gets a hit. Then Keith Mitchell gets a hit. Then Ray Knight gets a signal. Understand this. There was no one on base. There's 2 outs. And now Mookie Wilson comes up to bat. At this point, Mitch is upstairs. He was just getting too superstitious because they kept getting hits and this can't come true. They actually are going to be able to come back and win this game. So he doesn't come back down. And it's just me, Lisa, and Dave on the couch. And what happens? A little dribbler down first gets by Buckner. The Mets win the ball game. The Mets win. The Red Sox are in stunned disbelief. Yes, I can still hear the announcer's voice. The shock. You see, this was an easy ground ball, but Bill Buckner had a bum leg. He was not taken out of the game for defensive purposes. He was behind the bag. As Vin Scully said, behind the bag, gets by Buckner. The ball goes through his legs. Ray Knight comes in from second base. Pure pandemonium. No question, one of the best games ever in baseball. And of course, if you are a Mets fan, there's nothing that gets better. Because ultimately, yes, it does have a happy ending. They went on to win the next game. And they won the 1986 World Series. Second world championship, and still, after all these years, 63 years, 64 years, the Mets have only won 2 championships. From here, we go into the 90s, and now I'm with Prudential Insurance. I started there in 1987 when we got married. We had our 2 children beginning in 1992, our son Ryan, and as Ryan still talks about today, he was brought up as a Mets fan, of course, but here in North Jersey, surrounded by Yankee fans. And this time period, again, going back to the roller coaster metaphor, we ended up signing. We had the hangover, so to speak, from this time period with 86. We were still talented, but unfortunately, Dwight Gooden, Darryl Strawberry ended up having off-the-field issues. And the downfall really began shortly after. In Game 4 in 1988 in the National League Championship Series, Dwight Gooden is on the mound. We're going to another World Series. And Mike Scioscia hits a home run in the 9th inning. As we go into the 90s, we end up becoming the worst team money could buy in 1992, 1993. This was the time period of Bobby Bonilla, Brett Saberhagen, Vince Coleman, where you had just tension conventions in the clubhouse and really nothing was happening on the field. Until we end up going then into the turn of the century, Bobby Valentine became our manager. We signed Mike Piazza. Mike Piazza, during this time period, we went to the Subway Series. They called it that in the year 2000 against the big bad Yankees. And yes, we lost, but at least we made the World Series. And this was the time period of Edgardo Alfonso at second base, Al Leiter as our pitcher. And yes, we brought over Robin Ventura, and we had our closer, John Franco. But that lead up to the World Series was so much of what became of the new generation, the new O'Keefe generation with my son. And we were sitting at the edge of the bed in my bedroom, and Benny Agbayani is up to the plate. He hits a home run, and instinctually we just, again, for me, so much pent-up frustration of losing all these years and just hoping for something that my son could hold on to. And we just embraced and wouldn't let go. And then another pivotal home run, there was a reserve player. His name was Matt Franco. He ended up hitting a 3-run homer. This was at Casey Murdoch's birthday party. We're all gathered around the TV, and it was just a magical run. Again, you're a sports fan, you know the feeling is nothing better. But of course, misery returns. We don't end up going back to the World Series. As a matter of fact, we end up having a titanic, a miserable, a complete debacle of a collapse. And this is now in the time period of the mid-2000s. I am now winding down my Prudential insurance career. I am transitioning into being a teacher, and I'll never forget, I'm in the parking lot of William Patterson College, and the Mets in 2007, they had a 7-game lead with 17 games left, but collapsed. And they kept losing day after day. I kept thinking, no, they're going to win today. Of course they're going to be in the playoffs. No, they didn't even make the playoffs. This was the time period of the new ownership, of the Wilpons, of building Citi Field. This was the era of David Wrights, the iconic Mets. But it was heartbreak. The year before, in 2006, they had won the National League East. They were in the championship, ready to go back to the playoffs. This was also the era of Carlos Delgado. You had Carlos Beltran. And yeah, unfortunately, with Carlos Beltran being in the Hall of Fame, such a good player, what happened? His legacy with the Mets was not good despite years of success. Here he is, bases loaded, 2 outs. Bottom of the 9th inning, and the pitch comes. He doesn't swing. Call strike 3. The Mets lose. And yes, they end up losing again for the next 15 years. Yeah, we had some up and down years. We had some promise, but we don't end up going to the promised land, the World Series, again until 2015. At this point, I'm now a school teacher, happy with what I'm doing for a living, and yes, happy as a Mets fan. You had young pitchers again, which, talk about a theme of this team, good pitching, New York Mets, success. Who do we have now? Jacob deGrom, Noah Syndergaard, Matt Harvey. This is the dark night era of the team. We had a new manager, Terry Collins. We had players that Pete Alonso ends up coming on the scene, a product of University of Florida, a home run machine, so popular, the polar bear. And here we go, a wonderful drive through the playoffs and ultimately run into the Kansas City Chiefs, and we don't end up winning the World Series. So now, as of the recording of this podcast, going into 2026, the Mets, they had a turnover in ownership. We had Steve Cohen that came in and bought the team from the Wilpons. The Wilpons, during this time period of 2015, you had this investor, Bernard Madoff, who ended up swindling tons of people, one of them being the Wilpon family. Ultimately, we don't know exactly all the ramifications, but what we do know, money became an issue, and ultimately the Wilpons sold the team to Steve Cohen. And here we are today, a new era, a new team, new promises. And like I said, as of the recording of this episode, you never know what the future will entail, because now we have lost our polar bear. We have lost Pete Alonso, our first baseman. We have lost our closer, Edwin Diaz. And two instrumental Mets that came up through the system, Jeff McNeil, our second baseman, and Brandon Nimmo, our center fielder. What will the future bring? If you're a Mets fan, success is not necessarily around the corner. So to wrap up our podcast, and yes, this has been our longest podcast, New York Mets. Let's just rank the top iconic players in our history. And yes, it's my opinion. Tied for number 10, Cleon Jones and Tommy Agee of the Miracle Mets. Number 9, Nolan Ryan, yes, of the Miracle Mets. And he was a Met for a short time, but I'm sorry, he was once ours. Number 8, Jerry Koosman with that iconic slow leg kick as he delivered the baseball. Number 7, Pete Alonso, the polar bear. Number 6, Mike Piazza, who had that famous home run after 9/11. He was such a big part of the 2000 Mets. Number 5, David Wright. Everyone loves David Wright. Number 4, Dwight Gooden. Number 3, Keith Hernandez. Number 2, Darryl Strawberry. And yes, the franchise, Tom Terrific. Number 1, Tom Seaver. The best managers the Mets have ever had? Tied for third, my opinion, Bobby Valentine and Terry Collins. Number 2, Davey Johnson of the 86 Mets. And number 1, yeah, he brought the Mets their first world championship in 1969, Gil Hodges. And of course, the top 5 Mets teams, the only time the Mets have been to the World Series. Number 5, 2015, the Dark Knight era. Number 4, 2000, the Subway Series era, Mike Piazza. Number 3, 1973, the Tug McGraw, Gotta Believe Mets. Number 2, the Big Bad Boys of 1986. And of course, 1969 coming in at number 1, the Miracle Mets. Friends, thanks for taking us on this journey. This has been by far the longest podcast, but it was worth it. Reach out to me at kevmok21@gmail.com. We have a Facebook group. Any comments, questions, requests for future episodes? I always enjoy the reviews on Apple Podcasts or a podcast platform of your choice. And I will say this episode goes out to all those Mets fans that are in my life. You know who you are. From my neighbor to my colleague across the hall, we're always sharing ups and downs of our beloved Mets. And yes, let's keep the faith as we go into a new era. Friends, have fun and keep learning.